Have you ever stopped to think about how truly ridiculous death can be? I mean, we spend our entire lives worrying about the big stuff, the dramatic endings, the stuff you see in movies. But what if I told you that some of the most extraordinary creatures that ever walked this planet met their end in ways so absurd, so completely bonkers, that they'd make a slapstick comedy look like a documentary? Because here's the thing that absolutely blows my mind. We're talking about animals that survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and predators that could snap them in half without breaking a sweat. These were titans of their time, evolutionary masterpieces that dominated their environments for millions of years. And yet, when we dig up their fossilized remains today, we discover that many of them died in ways that are so bizarre, so utterly unexpected, that you'd think Mother Nature was having a laugh at their expense. And trust me, after diving deep into the fossil record and uncovering some of the most outrageous deaths ever preserved in stone, I can tell you that reality is stranger than any fiction you could imagine. We're talking about deaths so weird that paleontologists spent decades scratching their heads trying to figure out what the heck happened. Deaths that make you wonder if the universe has a twisted sense of humor. Now, before we dive into this wild journey through prehistoric misfortune, let me set something straight. I'm not here to make light of these ancient tragedies. These were real animals that lived, breathed, and suffered real pain. But there's something oddly fascinating about the sheer randomness of how life can end, especially when that ending gets frozen in time for us to discover millions of years later. What makes these deaths particularly incredible isn't just their weirdness, it's the fact that we can actually study them. Think about it for a second. The chances of any animal becoming a fossil are already astronomically low. You need perfect conditions, the right sediment, the right timing, and a whole lot of luck. So when we find fossils that preserve not just the animal, but the exact moment and manner of their death, we're looking at something truly extraordinary. And here's where it gets really interesting. Some of these deaths are so specific, so perfectly preserved, that they tell stories more detailed than any book you've ever read. We're talking about final moments captured in stone, complete with all the gory details that would make even the most seasoned detective cringe. So what exactly are we dealing with here? Well, imagine creatures drowning in their own waste. Picture flying reptiles getting skewered by plants in the most undignified way possible. Think about entire families meeting their end because they got a little too frisky during mating season. These aren't the epic battles against saber-toothed predators or dramatic volcanic disasters you might expect. These are deaths that would make you facepalm if they weren't so tragically real. But here's what really gets me excited about this topic. Each one of these bizarre deaths is like a puzzle piece that helps us understand not just how these animals died, but how they lived. Every weird fossil tells us something about ancient ecosystems, prehistoric behavior, and the eternal struggle between life and the absolutely ridiculous ways it can end. And the best part? We're just scratching the surface. For every strange death we've managed to uncover and understand, there are probably thousands more buried beneath our feet. waiting to be discovered. Who knows what other absurd endings are out there, preserved in rock, ready to make us question everything we thought we knew about the ancient world. Now, let me take you on a journey to South America, to a place where paleontologists made a discovery so mind-boggling that it completely changed how we think about mass extinctions. We're heading to Ecuador, to a fossil site that holds one of the most embarrassing mass graves in prehistoric history. Picture this. You're a paleontologist working in the dusty landscape of southwestern Ecuador, carefully excavating what appears to be just another fossil site. You're expecting to find the usual suspects, maybe some scattered bones, perhaps a tooth or two, but instead, you uncover something that makes you question your career choices and possibly your faith in the dignity of ancient life. What they found at this site called Tanque Loma was thousands upon thousands of bones belonging to some of the most impressive animals that ever lived in South America. These weren't your average creatures. We're talking about Eremotherium, massive ground sloths that would make modern elephants look like house pets. These giants stood 3 times taller than a human being, weighed in at around 4.5 tons, and measured about 20 feet from nose to tail. Now, when I say these were tough cookies, I mean they were built like living tanks. Their skeletons were so robust and dense that you'd think they were practically indestructible. These weren't delicate creatures that would keel over at the first sign of trouble. These were the heavyweight champions of the Pleistocene, animals that had been dominating the landscape for millions of years. So when researchers found nearly 24 of these fallen giants all clustered together, all having died at roughly the same time, somewhere between 18 and 23,000 years ago, they naturally assumed something epic had taken them down. Maybe a massive volcanic eruption, perhaps a catastrophic flood, or possibly even a dramatic climate shift that overwhelmed even these sturdy survivors. At first glance, the evidence seemed to support a dramatic ending. The site was loaded with asphalt deposits, similar to the famous La Brea tar pits in California. You know how that story goes, right? Animals get stuck in sticky tar, struggle helplessly, and eventually become preserved for future paleontologists to discover. It seemed like an open and shut case. But here's where things started getting weird. Unlike the La Brea specimens, where bones are typically found completely submerged in tar, these giant sloths only had portions of their bodies covered in the sticky stuff. It was as if they'd been partially dipped in asphalt rather than completely overwhelmed by it. This inconsistency made the research team throw out their tar pit theory and dig deeper into the mystery. And boy, did they find something unexpected. When they kept excavating around the sloth remains, they discovered an entire layer of material that surrounded the fossils. At first, they weren't sure what they were looking at. It was composed of various plant materials that showed clear signs of having been chewed and digested. But as they analyzed more of this layer, the horrible truth began to dawn on them. This wasn't just any random plant material. This was a massive accumulation of prehistoric poop. We're talking about a layer of fossilized feces so enormous that it represented over 80 tons of ancient waste, To put that in perspective, imagine a swimming pool filled entirely with prehistoric bathroom deposits. That's the kind of scale we're dealing with here. Now, you might be wondering how paleontologists figured out that this was the smoking gun they'd been looking for. Well, it turns out that this disgusting discovery actually made perfect sense when they started piecing together what had happened at this site all those thousands of years ago. The story that emerged was both tragic and absolutely ridiculous. These giant ground sloths had been living in an area that featured a shallow pool of water. Like many large herbivores, they used this water source not just for drinking, but also as a convenient bathroom. Over time, their repeated visits to this natural toilet facility began to transform the pristine pool into something far more sinister. As these bathroom breaks accumulated day after day, month after month, the once clear water became increasingly contaminated. Think about it from the sloth's perspective. They're massive animals with equally massive digestive systems, and they're all using the same convenient watering hole as their personal restroom. What started as a life-giving oasis slowly transformed into a toxic cesspool of epic proportions. But here's where the story gets even more twisted. These giant sloths, despite being incredibly intelligent animals, apparently never connected the dots between their bathroom habits and the increasingly nasty state of their water supply. They just kept coming back day after day, drinking from and wallowing in what was essentially becoming a prehistoric septic tank. As you can imagine, this situation created the perfect breeding ground for all sorts of nasty microorganisms. Bacteria, parasites, and every other pathogen you can think of began thriving in this toxic environment. The water became a literal death trap, but the sloths had no way of understanding the invisible danger they were creating for themselves. The end came during what appears to have been a drought period. As water sources dried up across the region, these giant sloths found themselves forced to rely more and more heavily on their contaminated pool. With nowhere else to go, they crowded into the area, drinking the poisoned water and unknowingly sealing their fate. What makes this story even more incredible is that researchers actually have a modern parallel to compare it to. Back in the 1970s, scientists observed a similar tragedy unfolding in Tanzania. A herd of 140 hippos took refuge in a shallow pool during a severe drought. Within just a few weeks, their own waste had transformed their refuge into a death trap, and over 100 members of the herd died from disease and poisoning. The ground sloths at Tanque Loma suffered the same fate, but on an even more dramatic scale. These magnificent creatures, survivors of countless challenges throughout their evolutionary history, were ultimately done in by their own poor bathroom etiquette. It's simultaneously tragic and absurd, a reminder that even the mightiest animals can fall victim to the most mundane circumstances. But if you think dying from poor sanitation is embarrassing, wait until you hear about the frogs who literally loved themselves to death. This next story takes us to Germany, to a fossil site that preserved one of the most awkward mass extinctions ever discovered. About 45 million years ago, what is now the Geiseltal region of Germany was a vast, lush swampland. It was paradise for amphibians, with countless pools and waterways providing the perfect habitat for frogs to thrive. The area was teeming with life, and by all accounts, these ancient frogs were living their best lives in what should have been an amphibian utopia. But something went terribly wrong in this prehistoric paradise. When paleontologists began excavating the area, they discovered hundreds upon hundreds of perfectly preserved frog fossils, all clustered together in what can only be described as a mass grave. The sheer number of dead frogs was staggering, and what made it even more puzzling was that they all appeared to have died simultaneously. For decades, this discovery remained one of paleontology's most baffling mysteries. The frogs showed no signs of disease, no evidence of predation, no indication of old age or injury. They were healthy, adult frogs who had simply died en masse for no apparent reason. It was like finding a crime scene with no clues, no weapon, and no motive. Researchers proposed various theories over the years. Maybe the swamp had suddenly dried up, forcing the frogs into a deadly scramble for the remaining water. But that didn't make sense, because the area had multiple water sources, and frogs are perfectly capable of moving between different pools. Maybe there had been some kind of toxic algae bloom or chemical poisoning, but there was no evidence of that either. The mystery seemed unsolvable until relatively recently, when scientists decided to take a closer look at the behavior of modern frogs and toads. What they discovered was both hilarious and horrifying. It turns out that for many amphibian species, mating season is literally a matter of life and death. During intense breeding periods, many frogs and toads become so focused on reproduction that they essentially forget how to take care of themselves. The males become incredibly aggressive and competitive, often engaging in what can only be described as amphibian wrestling matches. The females, meanwhile, can become so exhausted from the constant attention that they lose the ability to function normally. But here's where it gets really wild. In many species, the males will literally pile on top of females in the water, sometimes in groups of 10 or more. This behavior, called amplexus, can become so intense that females are pushed underwater and held there by the weight of multiple males. Unable to surface for air, they drown while still locked in the embrace of their overly enthusiastic suitors. Even more tragically, the males often become so fixated on mating that they lose track of their surroundings. They'll grab onto anything that moves, sometimes even other males, and refuse to let go. In their hormone-fueled frenzy, they forget basic survival skills like swimming and breathing, leading to mass drowning events that wipe out entire populations. When researchers applied this knowledge to the ancient German frogs, everything suddenly made perfect sense. These weren't victims of some dramatic environmental catastrophe. They were casualties of the most intense spring break party in prehistoric history. They had literally partied themselves to death in the most embarrassing way possible. The positioning of the fossils supported this theory perfectly. Many of the frogs were found still locked in amplexus, preserved for eternity in their final fatal embrace. Others were clustered together in ways that suggested they had been engaged in massive breeding aggregations when disaster struck. What makes this story even more poignant is that these particular frogs likely spent most of their lives on land, only returning to the water to mate. They weren't strong swimmers to begin with, which made these fatal breeding frenzies even more deadly. When you combine poor swimming skills with hormone-driven recklessness and overcrowded mating pools, you have a recipe for disaster. So there you have it, an entire population of frogs that died because they couldn't control themselves during mating season. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting passion override common sense, even in the animal kingdom. But as embarrassing as these deaths might seem, they pale in comparison to our next story, which involves a flying reptile that managed to get itself killed by a houseplant. Yes, you heard that right. We're about to meet a pterosaur that was taken down by vegetation in what might be the most undignified death in the entire fossil record. This tragic tale takes us to Brazil during the early Cretaceous period, about 110 million years ago. The skies were dominated by pterosaurs, magnificent flying reptiles that had mastered the art of powered flight long before birds became common. These weren't the clumsy gliders that eyesight, powerful flight muscles some people imagine. These were sophisticated aerial predators with keen and razor-sharp reflexes. Our unfortunate protagonist was a Ludodactylus, a fairly large pterosaur with a wingspan that would make modern eagles jealous. This particular specimen looked almost exactly like what most people picture when they think of pterodactyls, with that distinctive elongated skull and impressive array of sharp teeth. It was clearly built for life in the air, perfectly adapted for soaring over the ancient landscape and snatching prey from both land and water. But on one fateful day, this master of the skies encountered something that would prove to be its ultimate downfall. Something so mundane, so completely non-threatening, that it seems almost impossible that it could kill such a formidable predator. We're talking about a yucca plant. Now, if you've never encountered a yucca plant, let me paint you a picture. These things are basically nature's version of medieval weapons. Their leaves are long, narrow, and incredibly sharp, ending in points so vicious that they've earned nicknames like Adam's needle and Spanish bayonet. Gardeners today still regularly injure themselves on these plants, and emergency rooms see a steady stream of people who've had unfortunate encounters with yucca leaves. So picture this massive pterosaur cruising through the ancient Brazilian skies at high speed, probably hunting for fish or small animals below. Everything seems perfectly normal until suddenly this aerial predator makes a catastrophic miscalculation. Flying at what was likely considerable velocity, our Ludodactylus slams directly into a yucca plant with all the grace of a paper airplane hitting a ceiling fan. The impact was devastating. One of those razor-sharp yucca leaves punched straight through the pterosaur's lower jaw like a green spear, becoming permanently embedded in the bone. And here's the thing that makes this death particularly brutal. This wasn't an instant lights-out situation. No. This poor creature had to live with a massive plant spike protruding from its face, unable to eat, unable to drink, slowly starving to death over what must have been agonizing days or weeks. Can you imagine the confusion this animal must have felt? One moment, it's soaring majestically through the sky, master of its domain, apex predator of the airways. The next moment, it's got a houseplant literally growing out of its jaw, completely helpless and doomed. Talk about adding insult to injury. The fossil preservation is so perfect that we can actually see where the pterosaur desperately tried to remove the impaled leaf. There are scratch marks on the bone where it attempted to dislodge its green tormentor, but the yucca had embedded itself so deeply that all efforts were futile. The wound would have festered and become infected, making an already impossible situation even worse. What makes this discovery truly remarkable is that it's completely unique. In all of paleontological history, we've never found another fossil showing an animal killed by a plant in this specific way. This Ludodactylus holds the dubious honor of being the only known victim of death by vegetation impact. It's like finding the prehistoric equivalent of someone being killed by a particularly aggressive fern. But plants, as it turns out, are far more murderous than most people realize. Our next story involves another case of botanical brutality, this time featuring a turtle that had the misfortune of being in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time when the most catastrophic day in Earth's history unfolded. This brings us to one of the most significant events in our planet's timeline, the asteroid impact that ended the age of dinosaurs 66 million years ago. Now, most people think of this extinction event in terms of the big picture, the global catastrophe that wiped out massive creatures across entire continents. But what's absolutely fascinating is when we zoom in on the individual stories, the personal tragedies that played out in those final moments. At a site called Tanis in North Dakota, paleontologists have uncovered what amounts to a prehistoric disaster movie frozen in stone. This location is extraordinary because it preserves animals that were killed directly by the asteroid impact, not from the long-term effects like nuclear winter or climate change, but from the immediate, violent aftermath of the collision itself. And among the casualties discovered at this site was a turtle that experienced one of the most bizarrely specific deaths you could possibly imagine. This wasn't just any ordinary turtle demise. This poor reptile had been completely skewered by a tree branch, impaled like some kind of prehistoric shish kebab. Now, you might be wondering how exactly a turtle ends up getting speared by a tree. Well, the answer involves understanding just how absolutely chaotic things became in the immediate aftermath of the asteroid strike. We're talking about a level of destruction that makes every disaster movie ever made look like a gentle spring shower. When that 6-mile-wide rock slammed into what is now the Gulf of Mexico, it unleashed forces beyond human comprehension. The impact created earthquakes that would have registered off any scale we have today. Massive waves, some reaching heights of 300 feet, swept inland for thousands of miles. The atmosphere itself became a weapon, with superheated air blasts that could cook anything in their path. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the rain of debris that followed. The asteroid impact launched billions of tons of molten rock high into the atmosphere, where it cooled into glass beads called microtektites. These tiny projectiles then fell back to earth like a hailstorm from hell, except each hailstone was a piece of natural glass moving at terminal velocity. In this apocalyptic chaos, trees were being ripped from the ground and hurled through the air like toothpicks. Our unfortunate turtle was probably just minding its own business, maybe trying to find shelter from the mayhem, when a flying tree branch found it instead. The impact was so violent and the subsequent burial so rapid that the turtle was preserved in perfect three-dimensional detail, the wooden spear still protruding from its shell. What makes this discovery even more incredible is that Tanis is located about 2,000 miles from the actual impact site. That's roughly the distance from New York to Denver. Even at this enormous distance, the destruction was so complete and so violent that trees were being weaponized by the sheer force of the blast. The site has revealed other equally bizarre deaths. Fish were found with their gills packed full of glass spherules, meaning they essentially died from inhaling molten debris. Some dinosaurs were discovered mummified by the rapid burial, while others were found smashed to pieces by the massive waves that swept across the landscape. But let's shift gears from cosmic catastrophes to something a bit more down to earth, though no less dramatic. Our next tale takes us to the volcanic landscapes of Turkey, where we encounter a rhinoceros that experienced what might be the most literally explosive death ever recorded in the fossil record. The region of Cappadocia in Turkey is famous today for its otherworldly landscape, with strange rock formations that look like something from an alien planet. But this surreal terrain wasn't created by extraterrestrial visitors. Instead, it's the result of massive volcanic eruptions that took place millions of years ago, when three ancient volcanoes decided to redecorate the entire area with lava, ash, and pyroclastic flows. It was in this volcanic wonderland that scientists in 2012 made a discovery that perfectly illustrates just how brutal nature can be when it really puts its mind to it. They found the remains of a ceratotherium, an extinct relative of modern white rhinos. But this wasn't your typical fossil find. This rhino had been absolutely obliterated. The only part of the animal that survived was its head, which had been baked, fried, and dehydrated so thoroughly that it looked more like a piece of volcanic rock than actual bone. The surface was rough and corrugated, the teeth were brittle and corroded, and everything about the fossil screamed that this animal had experienced temperatures that would make a blast furnace seem comfortable. The evidence suggested that this incredibly unlucky rhino had been caught in a volcanic eruption that subjected it to temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. But the real kicker is what happened next. Just when you'd think being roasted alive was bad enough, the poor creature was then hit by a pyroclastic flow, which is basically a superheated avalanche of gas, ash, and volcanic rock moving at highway speeds. This 1-2 punch completely dismembered the rhino's body, explaining why only the head survived, despite being in otherwise perfect condition. It's like nature decided that simply cooking the animal wasn't dramatic enough and needed to add some explosive dismemberment for good measure. But wait, there's more. It turns out that prehistoric rhinos had a particular talent for getting themselves lava feed. In Washington state, researchers discovered something even more bizarre, a cave that was actually shaped like a rhino. Not carved to look like a rhino, but literally molded around an actual rhino that had been caught in a lava flow. The story behind this geological oddity is both tragic and strangely beautiful. Picture an ancient rhino wallowing in a water source, probably trying to cool off on a hot day. Suddenly, a volcanic eruption sends lava flowing directly toward the unsuspecting animal. But this lava wasn't moving particularly fast, which meant the rhino didn't die from direct contact with molten rock. Instead, it was killed by the indirect heat and toxic gases before the lava even reached it. Once dead, the rhino's body began to bloat and float on the water surface, giving it that characteristic upside-down pose that we often see in large deceased animals. When the lava finally reached the water, it enveloped the floating carcass like a hot blanket, while the surrounding water quickly cooled the outer layer, creating a perfect natural mold around the rhino's body. Over millions of years, erosion gradually cut this mold in half and exposed it to the world, creating what is essentially a rhino-shaped cave. It's simultaneously a tomb, a fossil, and a geological formation all rolled into one. Somewhere out there in Washington, hikers can literally walk inside the space once occupied by a prehistoric rhino's body. This discovery has led paleontologists to wonder if there might be other animal-shaped caves waiting to be discovered. Imagine stumbling across a dinosaur cave or maybe a mammoth-shaped cavern. The possibilities are both exciting and slightly morbid, but perhaps no prehistoric death is quite as mysterious or potentially disturbing as our next case, which involves our own ancient relatives and raises questions that researchers are still struggling to answer today. This story takes us to the heart of Africa, to a site that has become known as one of the most significant and puzzling discoveries in the study of human evolution. In the Afar Triangle of Ethiopia, paleontologists uncovered something that sent shock waves through the scientific community. They found a collection of bones and teeth that would become known as the first family, a group of at least 17 early human ancestors, all found in the same location, all having died at approximately the same time about 3.2 million years ago. Now, finding even a single complete early human fossil is incredibly rare. These creatures didn't exactly live in environments that were conducive to fossilization, and the chances of preservation were astronomically low. So discovering an entire family group that died together and were preserved together represents one of the rarest finds in all of paleontology. But what makes this discovery truly haunting isn't just its rarity. It's the mystery surrounding how all these individuals died. The evidence suggests they all perished simultaneously or within a very short time frame, which immediately raises the question of what could have killed an entire extended family of early humans all at once. Initially, researchers suspected a flash flood, which would have been a relatively straightforward explanation. Flash floods are common causes of mass deaths in the fossil record, and they can certainly wipe out entire groups of animals caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But when scientists analyzed the sediments around the fossils, they found no evidence of the kind of rapid water deposition you'd expect from flooding. This led to a much darker hypothesis, one that suggests these early humans may have been victims of a massacre. Not killed by other humans, mind you, but by large predators that specialized in hunting our ancestors. The question became, which predators were capable of taking down over a dozen early humans in a single attack? The prime suspects were initially thought to be giant hyenas, massive pack hunters that were known to be active in the region at the time. These weren't the relatively small hyenas we know today, but enormous predators that could easily overpower early humans. However, hyenas are notorious bone crushers that leave very little evidence behind, and the bones at the site were surprisingly well preserved. This shifted suspicion to large cats, particularly saber-toothed species, that were known to engage in surplus killing, hunting far more prey than they could actually consume. These cats were also known to avoid most bones when feeding, but they would occasionally swallow small bones from fingers and toes. Intriguingly, many of the finger and toe bones were missing from the first family site, which seemed to support the predation theory. The idea that our ancient relatives might have been systematically hunted by saber-toothed cats is both terrifying and fascinating. It suggests that early humans weren't just occasionally picked off by predators, but may have been specifically targeted by specialized man-eaters that had learned to hunt our species effectively. But not everyone accepts this predation hypothesis. Some researchers have proposed an alternative explanation that's equally disturbing in its own way. They suggest that the entire family died from severe food poisoning, possibly from eating contaminated plant material or spoiled meat. While food poisoning might not sound as dramatic as being hunted by saber-toothed cats, it can actually be devastatingly effective at wiping out entire groups. There are modern examples of mass poisoning events that have killed dozens of animals in very short time periods. And our early human ancestors would have been particularly vulnerable to foodborne pathogens. The fact that all the individuals died in essentially the same spot supports this theory, as it suggests they all consumed the same contaminated food source and then succumbed to poisoning before they could disperse. Given their primarily vegetarian diet, they might have eaten plants that had been contaminated by bacteria or toxins. However, this explanation also has its problems. Early humans were generally quite good at identifying safe foods, and it seems unlikely that an entire extended family would all make the same fatal mistake simultaneously. So we're left with a mystery that has persisted for decades. Did our ancient relatives fall victim to a coordinated predator attack, or did they die from a catastrophic case of food poisoning? The truth is, we may never know for certain, and that uncertainty makes this discovery all the more haunting. What we do know is that the first family represents one of the rarest and most significant windows into the dangers faced by our early ancestors. Whether they died from predation, poisoning, or some other unknown cause, their deaths provide a sobering reminder of just how precarious life was for early humans in prehistoric Africa. But death by predation or poisoning, as disturbing as those possibilities might be, at least makes some biological sense. Our next case ventures into territory so bizarre that it challenges everything we think we know about how prehistoric animals interacted with each other. This story takes us back to the Jurassic period, to an era when the oceans teemed with creatures that seem almost alien by today's standards. Picture the ancient seas of what would become Germany about 150 million years ago. These waters were home to an incredible diversity of marine life, including a fish called Tharsis and a cephalopod known as Belemnitella. Now, under normal circumstances, these two creatures would have had very little to do with each other. The fish was a small carnivore that fed primarily on decaying organic matter, while the cephalopod was essentially an ancient relative of modern squid. But paleontologists began finding fossils that defied all logic. They discovered multiple specimens showing these two completely different animals fused together in the most impossible way imaginable. We're talking about fossils that show the cephalopod somehow embedded inside the fish, like some kind of prehistoric sword-swallowing act gone horribly wrong. At first glance, you might assume this was some kind of predation event. Maybe the fish tried to eat the cephalopod and choked on it, or perhaps the cephalopod fought back and somehow impaled its attacker. But when researchers examined the fossils more closely, neither explanation made sense. The fish, despite being larger, was known to be a microcarnivore that fed on tiny organisms and soft tissue. There was absolutely no reason it would try to tackle a cephalopod half its own length. Meanwhile, the cephalopod, while it did possess a hard internal shell, wasn't known for using it as a weapon. These creatures were about as aggressive as modern squid, which is to say, not very aggressive at all. For years, this remained one of paleontology's most perplexing puzzles. How do you end up with multiple fossils showing two different species impaled together when neither species had any business interacting with the other in such a violent manner? It was like finding fossils of deer with porcupines somehow embedded in their stomachs. It just didn't make biological sense. The breakthrough came just recently when researchers noticed something peculiar about all the cephalopods in these bizarre fossils. They were covered with small organisms called bivalves, which are typically found growing on dead and decaying material. This was the crucial clue that unlocked the mystery. It turns out the cephalopods had been dead for quite some time before this fatal encounter ever took place. As their bodies decomposed, gas built up inside their internal shells, causing them to float to the ocean's surface like prehistoric balloons. Once at the surface, these floating corpses became incredibly dangerous traps. The fish, you see, had a habit of investigating floating objects at the surface, probably looking for easy meals or interesting debris. Under normal circumstances, size and shape differences would prevent any serious problems. A fish might mouth an object briefly before realizing it wasn't food and swimming away. But in this specific case, the aerodynamic design of the cephalopod shell and the particular feeding behavior of the fish created a perfect storm of prehistoric stupidity. The fish would approach the floating corpse, open its mouth to investigate, and the pointed end of the cephalopod shell would slide perfectly into the fish's throat like a key fitting into a lock. Once lodged in the fish's gills, the makeshift spear became impossible to dislodge. The fish would thrash and struggle, but the smooth, torpedo-shaped shell would only wedge itself deeper. Unable to breathe properly with this obstruction in its respiratory system, the fish would slowly suffocate, while the dead cephalopod remained permanently stuck in its throat. It's simultaneously tragic and absurd. These fish essentially died from trying to eat what amounted to prehistoric garbage. They were killed by their own curiosity and a series of incredibly unlucky coincidences that turned floating corpses into lethal weapons. What makes this discovery even more remarkable is that it wasn't a one-time freak accident. The fact that multiple fossils have been found showing the exact same scenario suggests this was a recurring problem in Jurassic seas. Somewhere in ancient Germany, dead cephalopods were regularly killing fish in the most ridiculous way possible. It's like discovering that a significant number of prehistoric animals died from slipping on banana peels, except the banana peels were actually decomposing squid relatives, and the slipping was actually death by accidental impalement. The sheer absurdity of it all makes you wonder what other bizarre death traps existed in the ancient world that we haven't discovered yet. But if you think death by floating garbage is weird, wait until you hear about the creatures that managed to get themselves killed by the weather in ways that seem almost designed to maximize embarrassment. This next story takes us to a time when the climate itself became a weapon of mass destruction, targeting some of the most successful animals that ever lived. During the late Pleistocene, much of North America was home to creatures that would seem mythical if we encountered them today. We're talking about animals so perfectly adapted to their environments that they dominated the landscape for millions of years. Among these were the American cheetahs, massive ground sloths, giant beavers the size of black bears, and short-faced bears that could look a modern grizzly in the eye. But around 13,000 years ago, something began happening to these magnificent creatures that was both gradual and catastrophic. The climate was changing, but not in the dramatic movie-style way you might imagine. There were no massive volcanic eruptions or asteroid impacts. Instead, the world was slowly warming up as the last ice age came to an end. Now, you'd think that warming temperatures would be good news for most animals. After all, who doesn't prefer a little less ice and snow in their daily life? But for many of these Pleistocene giants, the changing climate created problems they were completely unprepared to handle. Take the giant ground sloths, for example. These weren't just large versions of the tree-dwelling sloths we know today. They were massive, powerful animals that had spent millions of years perfectly adapted to Ice Age conditions. Their thick, shaggy coats were designed for cold weather. Their metabolism was calibrated for a world where food was scarce and energy conservation was crucial. As temperatures began rising, these walking carpets found themselves catastrophically overheating. Imagine wearing a full winter coat, wool socks, and a knit hat in the middle of summer, then being forced to exercise vigorously. That's essentially what happened to these creatures as their Ice Age world transformed around them. But the temperature change was just the beginning of their problems. As glaciers melted and weather patterns shifted, the plant communities that these animals depended on began changing as well. Grasslands turned into forests, familiar food sources disappeared, and new plants that the animals didn't recognize or couldn't digest began taking over. For creatures that had spent millions of years developing incredibly specialized diets, these changes were devastating. It's like being a master chef who suddenly finds that all the ingredients you know how to use have been replaced with completely different foods that you've never seen before. You might be the most skilled cook in the world, but if you don't know what any of the ingredients are, you're going to struggle. Some of these animals tried to adapt by changing their behavior, moving to new areas, or adjusting their diets. But evolution is a slow process, and climate change was happening faster than these creatures could keep up with. They were literally being outpaced by the weather. The giant beavers faced a particularly cruel irony. These massive rodents had spent millions of years engineering their environments, building dams and reshaping waterways to suit their needs. They were nature's original landscape architects, capable of transforming entire ecosystems through their construction projects. But as the climate changed, their carefully engineered environments began working against them. Dams that had been perfect for Ice Age conditions became death traps in the warming world. Ponds that had provided ideal habitat began drying up or becoming too warm. The very infrastructure they had built to ensure their survival became the mechanism of their destruction. Meanwhile, the short-faced bears found themselves in an equally impossible situation. These were apex predators, the undisputed kings of Pleistocene North America. Standing over 10 feet tall on their hind legs, they were larger and more powerful than any bear species alive today. They had ruled their ecosystems for millions of years, fear incarnate for every other creature on the continent. But as the climate changed, their prey animals began disappearing. The massive herbivores that had formed the foundation of their diet were struggling with the same environmental changes, and as they declined, the bears found themselves with less and less to eat. These ultimate predators, perfectly designed for hunting megafauna, suddenly found themselves in a world where megafauna was becoming increasingly scarce. It's like being the world's most skilled whale hunter just as whales start going extinct. Your expertise becomes not just useless but actively counterproductive because you're so specialized for hunting creatures that no longer exist that you can't adapt to hunting smaller, more abundant prey. The American cheetahs faced perhaps the cruelest fate of all. These weren't quite the same as African cheetahs, but they were built for speed, capable of running down prey across the open grasslands that dominated Ice Age America. They were the Ferrari of the Pleistocene, evolution's answer to the need for high-speed pursuit predation. But as forests began replacing grasslands, these speed demons found themselves in an environment where their greatest asset became a liability. Try to imagine a Formula One race car being forced to navigate through a dense forest. That's essentially what happened to these cats, as their open hunting grounds were replaced by thick woodlands, where their incredible speed was not just useless, but actually dangerous. Many of these cheetahs probably died simply from running into trees at high speed while trying to chase prey through unfamiliar forested terrain. Others likely starved as their preferred prey animals adapted to woodland environments where the cats couldn't effectively hunt them. What makes all of these climate-related deaths particularly tragic is that they happened to animals that were otherwise perfectly healthy and successful. These weren't weak or sickly creatures that were already struggling to survive. These were the champions of their ecosystems, animals that had proven their evolutionary worth over millions of years. But evolution, for all its power, has one critical weakness. It can only prepare organisms for the environments they've experienced in the past. When conditions change faster than natural selection can keep up, even the most successful species can find themselves fatally unprepared for their new reality. The fossil record from this period tells a story of confusion and desperation. We find evidence of animals trying to survive in completely inappropriate habitats, like tropical adapted creatures trying to make it through winter, or desert specialists attempting to live in swamps. It's heartbreaking in its futility. Some researchers have compared this period to a massive game of musical chairs, where the music suddenly stops and there aren't enough chairs for everyone. Except in this case, the chairs are ecological niches, and the music stopping represents rapid climate change. The animals that couldn't find a new chair fast enough simply didn't make it. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these climate-related deaths is how preventable they seem in hindsight. These weren't dramatic, instantaneous catastrophes. They were slow-motion disasters that unfolded over thousands of years, giving plenty of time for intervention if anyone had been around to help. It's like watching someone slowly walk into quicksand over the course of several hours. You can see exactly what's happening. You know exactly how it's going to end, but you're powerless to change the outcome. That's essentially what the fossil record shows us about the end of the Pleistocene megafauna. The irony is that many of these same animals might have survived if they had encountered the same climate changes at a different point in their evolutionary history. Evolution is all about timing, and these magnificent creatures simply had the misfortune of living through rapid environmental change at a point when they were too specialized to adapt quickly enough. Their deaths serve as a sobering reminder that success conditions change. The very in one environment doesn't guarantee survival when adaptations that made these animals incredibly successful during the Ice Age became death sentences when the Ice Age ended. And the truly chilling part is that this pattern of climate-related extinction is still happening today, just on a much faster timescale. The same forces that doomed the Pleistocene giants are still at work, still catching successful species off guard as their perfectly adapted characteristics become suddenly inappropriate for their rapidly changing world. But let's shift away from these slow-motion climate disasters and dive into something that happened in the blink of an eye. Because if you thought dying from weather changes was rough, wait until you meet the animals that managed to get themselves killed by their own success. This next story is about creatures that were so incredibly good at what they did that it literally became the death of them. Picture the ancient forests of what is now Montana about 15 million years ago. The landscape was dominated by massive sequoia trees that stretched toward the sky like living skyscrapers. Among these giants lived a creature that seemed to have hit the evolutionary jackpot. We're talking about Paleontologists, an ancient beaver that had taken the whole damn building thing to absolutely ridiculous extremes. Now, when I say these were successful animals, I mean they were the undisputed masters of prehistoric engineering. Modern beavers are impressive, sure, but these ancient relatives made them look like amateur weekend DIY enthusiasts. Paleontologists didn't just build dams, they constructed elaborate underground cities that would make a mining engineer weep with envy. These weren't simple burrows either. We're talking about spiral tunnels that corkscrewed deep into the earth, some extending over 8 feet down with perfectly engineered curves and chambers. The construction was so sophisticated that when paleontologists first discovered these structures, they thought they were looking at some kind of bizarre geological formation. But here's where the story takes a turn toward the absolutely absurd. These master builders, these champions of prehistoric construction, had developed such an obsession with perfection that they literally worked themselves to death. The fossil evidence suggests that many paleontologists died while still actively excavating their tunnels, trapped in their own elaborate constructions like furry prisoners in self-made dungeons. Think about the sheer irony of this situation. These animals had spent millions of years evolving to be the ultimate diggers and builders. They had powerful claws, robust shoulders, and an instinctive understanding of engineering that would make a modern architect jealous. They were so good at construction that they could create underground mansions that would last for millions of years. But somewhere along the way, their success became their downfall. They became so focused on building the perfect burrow system that they forgot about little details like, being able to get back out. Many fossils show these industrious creatures collapsed in their tunnels, apparently having worked so hard and so long that they exhausted themselves to death in their own constructions. It's like finding the skeleton of a master chef who died while preparing the perfect meal, still clutching a whisk in their hand. These beavers were victims of their own perfectionism, killed by their inability to know when to quit while they were ahead. But if you think dying from overwork is embarrassing, our next case involves creatures that managed to kill themselves through pure, unadulterated vanity. This story takes us to the late Cretaceous period to meet some of the most spectacularly ridiculous dinosaurs that ever existed. We're talking about the Lambeosaurans, a group of duck-billed dinosaurs that had developed the most elaborate head crests you could possibly imagine. These weren't just simple decorations either. These crests were complex hollow structures that functioned like living trumpets, allowing the dinosaurs to produce incredibly loud and distinctive calls. Now, having a fancy head crest might seem like a pretty good evolutionary strategy. After all, being able to communicate effectively with your own species is generally considered a survival advantage. These dinosaurs could produce calls so loud and unique that they could identify family members from miles away, coordinate group movements, and warn each other about approaching predators. But here's where things went completely off the rails. These dinosaurs became so obsessed with having the most impressive headgear that they started developing crests that were absolutely ridiculous in their complexity. We're talking about structures so elaborate and unwieldy that they started interfering with basic survival activities like eating and running. Some species developed crests that were so long and curved that they had trouble reaching food on the ground. Others created such massive hollow chambers in their heads that their skulls became fragile and prone to fracturing from even minor impacts. It was like prehistoric animals decided to compete in a contest for the most impractical hat imaginable. The fossil record shows us lambeosaurines with crests so elaborate that they probably couldn't move through dense vegetation without getting tangled up. Imagine trying to run away from a predator while wearing a 6-foot-long curved horn that catches on every branch and vine in the forest. It's like trying to escape danger while wearing a chandelier on your head. Even worse, some of these crests became so acoustically sophisticated that the dinosaurs apparently became addicted to the sounds they could make. Fossil sites show evidence of entire herds that seem to have spent so much time honking and calling to each other that they forgot to watch out for predators or search for food. There are bone beds that suggest these musical dinosaurs would gather in large groups for what can only be described as prehistoric concerts, honking and trumpeting with such enthusiasm that they attracted every carnivore in a 50-mile radius. It's like advertising your location to every hungry predator in the neighborhood with a giant neon sign that says, "Free dinner here." The most tragic cases involved juveniles whose crests grew so rapidly that their necks couldn't support the weight. These poor creatures essentially died from having their heads become too heavy for their own bodies. Imagine explaining that to other dinosaurs. "Yeah, my head got so fancy that my neck broke." Pretty embarrassing way to go. But perhaps no death in the fossil record quite captures the absurdity of prehistoric life like our next case, which involves a creature that managed to get itself killed by its own digestive system in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. This story takes us back to the Jurassic Seas, where we encounter Leedsichthys, a fish so enormous that it makes modern whale sharks look like minnows. This prehistoric giant could grow to lengths of over 50 feet, making it one of the largest bony fish that ever lived. It was basically the ancient equivalent of a living submarine, cruising through Jurassic oceans and filter feeding on plankton and small organisms. Now, you'd think that being the size of a city bus would be a pretty good survival strategy. Most predators would take one look at this massive fish and decide to find an easier meal elsewhere. And for the most part, that strategy worked brilliantly for millions of years. But Leedsichthys had one fatal flaw that would ultimately prove to be its undoing. This massive fish was essentially a living vacuum cleaner, sucking up enormous quantities of plankton and small prey without much discrimination. And therein lay the problem. You see, the Jurassic oceans were full of ammonites, those spiral-shelled relatives of modern squid and octopus. Most of the time, these ammonites were perfectly harmless additions to the giant fish's diet. They provided good nutrition and went down easy, just another part of the all-you-can-eat buffet that was Jurassic plankton. But occasionally, Leeds ichthys would encounter an ammonite that wasn't quite dead yet. And these living ammonites had a defense mechanism that would prove catastrophic when deployed inside the stomach of a giant fish. When threatened, ammonites could rapidly expel water from their shells to jet away from danger, kind of like prehistoric rocket propulsion. So picture this enormous fish cruising along, mindlessly vacuuming up everything in its path, when suddenly it swallows a very much alive and very unhappy ammonite. The ammonite, finding itself in the incredibly unpleasant environment of a fish's stomach, does what ammonites do. It fires its water jet propulsion system at full power. Now, under normal circumstances in open water, this would just shoot the ammonite away from whatever was threatening it. But inside the confined space of a fish's digestive system, that sudden blast of high-pressure water had nowhere to go except into the surrounding tissues. The result was essentially a biological depth charge going off inside the fish's body. The pressure wave from the ammonite's escape attempt would rupture internal organs, tear through tissue, and cause massive internal bleeding. It was like swallowing a tiny torpedo that decided to explode on the way down. Fossil evidence suggests that this wasn't exactly a rare occurrence either. Multiple Leedsichthys specimens have been found with ammonite shells embedded in their rib cages, suggesting that these living depth charges were a recurring hazard for filter-feeding giants. The really tragic part is that these fish were probably killed by prey items that represented a tiny fraction of their overall diet. It's like being a giant who dies from choking on a single popcorn kernel. The sheer size difference between predator and prey makes the whole situation seem almost cosmically unfair. But the ammonite attacks pale in comparison to our next case, which involves a prehistoric predator that managed to get itself killed by its own hunting technique in the most ironic way possible. Meet Thylacosmolus, a saber-toothed marsupial that lived in South America during the Pliocene epoch. This wasn't just any ordinary predator. This was an animal that had evolved some of the most impressive killing tools in the entire fossil record. We're talking about saber teeth so large and sharp that they could punch through the skulls of prey animals like they were made of paper. These teeth weren't just big, they were perfectly designed killing machines. Curved for maximum penetration, serrated for efficient cutting, and positioned at exactly the right angle for delivering devastating bite wounds. Thylacosmolus was basically a four-legged sword with an attitude problem. And for millions of years, this strategy worked brilliantly. These marsupial predators were the apex hunters of their ecosystems, capable of taking down prey much larger than themselves through precision strikes with their incredible dental weapons. But evolution, as we've learned, can sometimes be a little too clever for its own good. Over time, natural selection kept making Thylacosmolus teeth bigger and sharper and more impressive. Each generation had slightly more formidable fangs than the last, and each generation was slightly more effective at killing prey. The problem was that nobody told evolution when to stop. The teeth just kept getting bigger and bigger until they reached a point where they became actively counterproductive. We're talking about saber teeth so enormous that they extended well below the animal's lower jaw, making it impossible to close its mouth properly. Imagine trying to eat with a pair of 12-inch knives permanently attached to your upper teeth. Every meal becomes an exercise in precision engineering, and every bite risks stabbing yourself in the foot. That's essentially what happened to late-stage Thylacosmolus. The fossil record shows us specimens with saber teeth so overgrown that they couldn't feed efficiently. These ultimate predators, armed with the most impressive weapons in the animal kingdom, were slowly starving to death because their teeth were too big to use effectively. Even worse, the massive teeth made the animals' skulls top-heavy and fragile. Many fossils show evidence of skull fractures that probably occurred when the animals tried to use their oversized weapons. They were literally breaking their own heads from the recoil of their own bite force. The final irony is that these supersized saber teeth made the animals incredibly vulnerable to exactly the kind of injuries they were designed to inflict on others. The teeth were so large and prominent that they became targets for other predators. It's like wearing a "Kick Me" sign that also happens to be made of expensive jewelry. Some specimens show evidence of saber tooth breakage that probably led to fatal infections. These master killers, armed with evolution's finest cutting implements, were dying from infected broken teeth like prehistoric dental patients without access to antibiotics. But if you think death by over-engineering is bad, wait until you hear about the creatures that managed to get themselves killed by their own social media habits. Yes, you heard that right. Millions of years before humans invented Instagram, some animals were already dying from their obsession with showing off. This brings us to the story of Carnotaurus, a predatory dinosaur from late Cretaceous Argentina that had developed what could only be described as the prehistoric equivalent of a selfie addiction. These weren't your typical theropod dinosaurs. Carnotaurus had evolved a pair of prominent horns above their eyes that gave them a distinctly demonic appearance. Now, horns on predatory dinosaurs weren't exactly uncommon. Lots of carnivorous species had various bumps, ridges, and protrusions on their skulls. But Carnotaurus took this concept to an absolutely ridiculous extreme. Their horns weren't just decorative features, they were elaborate display structures designed of their species. Said to impress other members' problem was that these dinosaurs became so obsessed with showing off their impressive headgear that they started engaging in increasingly dangerous display behaviors. Fossil evidence suggests that Carnotaurus individuals would engage in elaborate head-butting contests, ramming their horned skulls together with tremendous force to establish dominance. Think of it as prehistoric mixed martial arts, except the fighters were 3,000-pound killing machines with built-in battering rams for heads. The contests were probably spectacular to watch, but they were also incredibly dangerous for the participants. Multiple Carnotaurus skulls have been found with evidence of repeated impacts and fractures around the horn areas. These weren't battle scars from fighting prey or defending against other predators. These were self-inflicted injuries from voluntary participation in what amounted to dinosaur boxing matches. Some specimens show evidence of brain damage from repeated concussions, suggesting that these display contests were literally scrambling the participants' brains. It's like finding evidence that prehistoric animals were giving themselves chronic traumatic encephalopathy for the sake of looking cool in front of their peers. The most tragic cases involved juveniles who apparently started participating in these contests before their skulls were fully developed. Young Carnotaurus with incompletely fused cranial bones were engaging in head-butting contests that their developing brains simply couldn't handle. Fossil sites have revealed what appear to be Carnotaurus gathering areas where multiple individuals would come together for these display contests. It's like prehistoric fight clubs, except the first rule of Dinosaur Fight Club was apparently that everyone talks about Dinosaur Fight Club, because they kept doing it in the same locations over and over again. The really depressing part is that many of these display-related deaths were completely preventable. The dinosaurs weren't fighting for resources or defending territory or protecting their young. They were literally killing themselves for social status, dying to impress other dinosaurs who were probably also going to die from the same stupid behavior. But perhaps the most bizarrely poetic death in our entire catalog belongs to a creature that managed to get itself killed by its own reflection. This final story takes us to the Miocene epoch to meet Dinotherium, a relative of modern elephants that had developed one of the most unusual feeding adaptations in mammalian history. Unlike modern elephants, which use their tusks for digging, fighting, and manipulating objects, Dinotherium had evolved tusks that curved downward from their lower jaw. These reverse tusks were perfectly designed for stripping bark from trees and digging up roots, making these animals incredibly efficient at exploiting food sources that other herbivores couldn't access. But there was one environmental hazard that Dinotherium was completely unprepared for, and that was large bodies of still water. You see, these animals had excellent eyesight and were quite intelligent, but they had never encountered anything like their own reflection before. When a Dinotherium approached a lake or large pond to drink, it would see what appeared to be another member of its species with identical downward curving tusks looking back at it. And since these animals were naturally territorial and used visual displays to establish dominance, they would interpret their reflection as a challenge from a rival. So there you have it, folks. A journey through some of the most absolutely ridiculous ways that prehistoric life managed to shuffle off this mortal coil. From giant sloths drowning in their own waste to flying reptiles getting skewered by houseplants, from frogs literally loving themselves to death to our own ancient relatives possibly falling victim to the world's first documented case of mass food poisoning. These stories remind us that death, even millions of years ago, had a twisted sense of humor and absolutely zero regard for dignity. What strikes me most about these bizarre fossilized endings is that they represent just the tiniest fraction of the weird ways life has found to end itself throughout Earth's history. For every strange death we've managed to uncover and decode, there are probably millions more buried beneath our feet, waiting to surprise us with their sheer absurdity. And honestly, that thought both terrifies and excites me in equal measure. But beyond the morbid entertainment value, these fossils serve as humbling reminders that no